Hi everyone, and welcome to module number 7. We're going to talk about augmented and diminished intervals. So these are the other kinds of intervals besides perfect, major, and minor. So our objectives are to be able to identify augmented and diminished intervals on the staff, and be able to write augmented and diminished intervals on the staff as well. Okay, so let's define what they are. An augmented interval, they are just one half step larger than perfect or major intervals. Okay? And then diminished intervals are the opposite of that. They're one half step smaller than their perfect or minor versions. And you'll see that I'm separating perfect from major and perfect from minor, and that's because these depend on the number of the interval, right? So you know that unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves can be perfect, right? They can't be major, they can't be minor, but they can only be perfect, okay? But if you have a unison, a fourth, a fifth, or an octave that is one half step bigger than it should be for being perfect, we call it augmented. So augmented is just kind of like a stretched out version of perfect, right? It's just slightly smaller, slightly bigger than a perfect interval should be. Okay? And if you have an interval that's perfect, so a perfect unison, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, or perfect octave, that's smaller by one half step than it should be, it is diminished. So this is like a shrunken version of a perfect interval. Okay? And then this also applies to seconds, thirds, sixths, or sevenths, and you know that those can be either major or minor, right? And if something is major, it's one half step bigger than minor, right? So if you take a major interval and it's made to be one half step bigger than it normally should be, then we call it augmented. And if it is one half step smaller than what a minor interval should be, it's called diminished. So these are like, they're kind of like stretching out the interval bigger or squishing it down smaller than it normally should be, right? So these are just the special names to say that these are either bigger than perfect or bigger than major, or they're smaller than perfect or smaller than minor. Okay? Alright, so let's look at how to identify augmented and diminished intervals. So you want to use the same technique that we did before, comparing the interval to a major scale. If it's one half step bigger than perfect or major, then it's an augmented interval. If it's one half step smaller, then it should be for perfect or minor. Then it is a diminished interval. Okay? So some examples here. This first one, we know it's a fourth because it doesn't matter if it's perfect, major, minor, diminished, augmented, doesn't matter. It takes up 4 lines and spaces on the staff, so we automatically know that this is a fourth. So that means that this interval could either be perfect, or if it's not perfect, then it could be augmented or it could be diminished. So let's see. So we know that we want to compare this to an F major scale. So that fourth note should be a B flat because the key of F major, scale of F major, has a B flat as its fourth note. So if it were a B flat, it would be a perfect fourth. But this isn't a B flat, it is a B natural. Okay, so that B natural is one half step higher than B flat, which means that this is not a perfect fourth, this is an augmented fourth. Okay, because if it were a B flat, it would be a perfect fourth, but it is larger by one half step because it's a B natural, so it's called an augmented fourth. Okay, over here we have an example in bass clef, so don't let that throw you. These notes are a B and a D flat. And you can see, it doesn't matter what the accidentals are, this takes up 3 lines and spaces on the staff, so it's going to be some kind of third, which means that it could be a major third, it could be a minor third, but it could also be an augmented third, and it could be a diminished third. All right? So let's look at what this should be to be a major third. So we want to compare this to a B major scale, and the third of a B major scale is D sharp. So if this were B to D sharp, it would be a major third. And if it were, but it's not, but if it were a D natural, it would be a minor third. But it's not that either. It is actually one half step smaller than a minor third. So this will be, in fact, be a diminished third. Okay? And note that I'm using a little bit of an abbreviation. I'm using a circle to indicate diminished, and I'm using a plus to indicate augmented. And that's kind of the notation we'll use for this unit here. So this last one here is a sixth. Doesn't matter that it has two crazy accidentals on it, right? It takes up 6 lines and spaces on the staff, so it's called a sixth. So let's figure out what it could be. So it could either be major, minor, but also augmented or diminished. And so we know that in an A flat major scale, the sixth of the scale is an F natural. So F natural would be a major sixth, but that's not what we have here. Okay, instead we have an F sharp, which means that this interval is 1/2 step bigger than what a major sixth should be. So this is going to be an augmented sixth. You can see that I've used a little plus there to indicate that. Okay, so that's how you identify them. So, you know, you want to compare them to a major scale, and if it's bigger than a perfect or bigger than a major, then it's augmented. And if it's smaller than perfect or smaller than minor, then it is diminished. Okay, let's talk about how to write augmented and diminished intervals on the staff. It's the same process as before. So for augmented, you want to write the perfect or major interval and then add an accidental that makes it larger by a 1/2 step. For diminished, write the perfect or minor interval and then add an accidental that makes it smaller by a 1/2 step. So we're going to try to write a diminished fifth above this G natural. Okay, so we'll start by writing the perfect version of this, because a fifth can be perfect, right? And so that is a D natural. And we want to make this into diminished, because right now it's perfect. So let's look at that on the piano to kind of visualize what it means to make something smaller. So that's the note G on the piano. That's the high note D on the piano. And we want to shrink this so that it becomes diminished. So we need to move that top note down by a 1/2 step. And in the notation, that means the D natural becomes a D flat. And so now it's still a fifth, okay, because it still needs to be a fifth, but it is smaller than it should be, so it's diminished. Okay. Another example, we're going to try to write an augmented second below this E natural. So if for writing a augmented interval, I want to start by writing the major interval. And so a major second below E would be D. Okay, so right now I have a major second. You can see that on the piano. In order to make this augmented, I want to make this interval larger by a 1/2 step. Now you might think, well, to make something larger or higher, right, I add a sharp. But it's always relative to the note that's already there. So to make this larger by 1/2 step, you don't actually add a sharp. You have to stretch it out, right? You have to make that D lower than it normally would be. So that D has to move down by a 1/2 step to become D flat. And you can see on the piano it also moved down a 1/2 step too. So you're not always raising or lowering a note. You are either making an interval bigger or smaller. Okay, and you just use the accidentals to make that happen. All right, one more example here. Okay, we have the note A here. We want to try to write a diminished seventh above this A. So I know that if I add a G sharp, that's going to be a major seventh, right? Which is not what we want. But we can look at that on the piano to see where that's at. So that's a major seventh there. Okay, and if I lower that G sharp by a 1/2 step, it becomes a G natural, and then we have a minor seventh, which is still not what we want. We want to make this even smaller, but we can't change that note, right? It still has to be a G. So in order to do that, we make it a G flat. And you can see on the piano, the interval has shrunk by a 1/2 step, and on the staff, we've made the G into a G flat, okay? Now notice, once I write the notes on the staff, right, I'm not changing the line that they're on, because that would change the name, right? It would change the letter, and it would also change the number of the interval, right? It would change the distance it takes up on the staff. So the distance it takes up on the staff never changes. What changes is the amount of space it takes up on the piano, and that is affected by the accidentals. Okay, so you're always adding a note that makes the number correct, but then you're adding accidentals that will make the quality correct. Okay, so let's talk about one special thing that you may have realized. That is that the interval of an augmented fourth and a diminished fifth sound the same, right? So if I play E to B flat, it sounds the same as B flat to E, right? Those are the same sound, right? So we call this special interval a tritone, right? And it used to be considered the devil in music. Really wasn't that serious. It just meant a mistake to be avoided, but people have latched onto that because it sounds really dissonant, right? And so that name has kind of stuck. But the special interval spans 6 half steps on the keyboard. Okay? And if you've realized that there are 12 half steps on the piano, right? There are 12 unique notes. You know that this means that this interval, divides the octave perfectly in half. Okay? So we can see how this works. So I've marked the 2 notes on the piano, an E natural and a B flat. And let's count the half steps. So this spans a total of 6 half steps from that lower E to that top B flat. And if we look at the other direction, from the B flat to the E, it also spans 6 half steps. Okay, so because there are 12 half steps in our system, right, this tritone kind of divides the octave perfectly in half, which is why a diminished fifth and an augmented fourth sound exactly the same, because they span the same distance. Okay, so you'll often hear people just refer to a tritone, and that can either mean an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth, depending on the context, but we're really referring to the same thing. Okay, great. So that's a little tutorial of augmented and diminished intervals. If you have any questions about that, you can ask in the Zoom session or on the discussion forum. And yeah, other than that, thanks for watching and have a great day.